I first met my ex, let's call him Eric, during our freshman year of college. We were both in a basic composition class, where he sat 2 rows behind me. At first, he had this shy, nerdy charm that caught my attention. There was something about the way he laughed at his own jokes, and the way he'd tilt his head whenever he tried to make a point, that made me want to talk to him more. We started chatting about the syllabus and eventually about a group project our professor assigned in the second week. From there, things evolved quickly. He seemed funny, smart in his own way, and eager to explore new activities. Looking back, it's obvious how many red flags I shrugged off. He was incredibly private, to the point of secrecy, about every aspect of his life, from his family to his friends. Meeting his mother or his sisters was never an option, and if they happened to be around campus, I was never introduced. Whenever I brought it up, Eric would respond with something vague, like, "Now's not a good time," or "They're just not very social." When it came to his friends, he got even more defensive. If I suggested a group hangout or a double date, he'd say things like, "I don't think my friends would get along with you," or "That's kind of weird. Why do you want to hang out with them so badly?" It stung, but I let it go because I believed I was in love. Eric and I dated on and off for about 2 years, a time frame which, in hindsight, should have been enough for me to realize the back-and-forth nature of our relationship was unhealthy. But each time we broke up after a heated argument, he'd come back to me with tearful apologies and grandiose words. "You're the love of my life. We belong together. Can't you see that one day you and I will be married?" And he always managed to say these things in moments that felt so raw and sincere. I wanted to believe him, so I'd forgive him, convinced that the sweet promises might one day become reality if we could just iron out the kinks in our relationship. One of the biggest mistakes I made was paying for one of his quarters of tuition when his FAFSA got cut off. He'd lost his financial aid because of incomplete paperwork and some missing credits from the previous semester. At the time, Eric didn't have a job. He claimed he was applying to various places but hadn't found anything yet. Meanwhile, I had a small amount of savings set aside for emergencies and future rent. But when he came to me, desperate and anxious, I felt compelled to help. I paid $700 toward his tuition with the verbal agreement that once he got on his feet, he'd pay me back. Eventually, he was hired by a well-known security company that contracts out guards for corporate buildings. He started earning more money than I was making with my part-time campus job. Yet, every time I brought up the $700, he'd brush me off. "I can't spare it right now." Or "I just had some big bills, maybe next month." Frustrating, to say the least, but I still believed he'd come through in the end. Then there was Bella. She was the longtime friend who frequently popped up in Eric's life. They played online games together nearly every night, exchanged memes, and attended local events together. He referred to her affectionately, sometimes as a silly nickname, but often just Bella. Whenever I asked if I could join their gaming sessions, he found excuses like, "It's a closed group," or "We already have enough people." He'd occasionally show me pictures of them hanging out, but always after the fact. Oh, by the way, Bella and I went to that midnight release. The strangest part? Bella supposedly had a boyfriend of her own, someone I never met, which made me wonder if anything fishy was going on. Even if there wasn't outright cheating, the boundaries were definitely blurry. I expressed discomfort several times, especially when I learned Bella sent him suggestive pics even though he was in a relationship with me. But Eric waved me off. "She's just joking around. Don't be so sensitive." Fast forward to the invitation that felt like a chance to reconnect. Eric asked me to join him at a Comic-Con event about 2.5 hours from our city. I love comics, anime, and pop culture, so I jumped at the opportunity. I spent the evening before meticulously preparing. He stayed at my place that night, and I wanted us to have a smooth trip. I double-checked our tickets, packed phone chargers, and prepared snacks. Since neither of us had a car, we'd take an early bus out to the convention center. I was excited, picturing the two of us geeking out over merch and cosplay. Yet, on the bus ride there, something was off. Eric was glued to his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. If I tried to talk, he'd offer one-word answers or grunts. Every so often, I'd catch him smiling at his screen or typing furiously. If I asked, "What's going on?" he'd lock his phone and mutter, "Nothing." The tension was palpable, but I chalked it up to early morning grouchiness. I thought maybe once we arrived, he'd loosen up and get into the spirit of the con. We got off the bus near the convention center, and he immediately seemed agitated. I wanted to grab a quick coffee at a nearby Starbucks since it was a long ride, but Eric snapped that we were already late. The next thing he said was basically, "I'd rather just go inside with my friends." It took me a second to register that he meant Bella and whoever else was inside. The fact that he said friends, plural, was suspicious because he never said who exactly was joining them. My heart sank. I asked if he'd at least walk with me to the coffee shop or wait a moment so I could get something to drink, but he started raising his voice. "Stop wasting time," he yelled. "I'm going in." I felt tears sting the back of my eyes. This was supposed to be a fun trip, something for us to enjoy together. And here he was, abandoning me on the sidewalk. He stormed off, weaving through the crowd of cosplayers, and I stood there, stunned, coffeeless, feeling foolish. I tried to will myself not to cry, but the tears came anyway. I kept thinking, what did I do to deserve this? Why would he invite me just to ditch me? But that's exactly what happened. He vanished into the convention without a backward glance. With no reason to stay, I turned around and went straight back to the bus stop. The entire 2.5-hour ride home, I alternated between numbness and intense anger, replaying our relationship in my head. I recalled every time he'd promised me the world, then acted like I was disposable when he wanted something else. Why had I let him do this for so long? Finally, I arrived at my apartment, drained and miserable. That's when I saw it on my coffee table. Eric's brand new $2,000 laptop. He'd brought it over the night before for some reason, maybe to do some last-minute online gaming. He must have been in such a hurry that morning that he forgot to pack it. At first, I just stared at it, trying to decide what to do. Then, a petty yet justified thought entered my mind. He owes me $700. In that moment, I saw the laptop as leverage. Not theft, not revenge, although if I'm honest, it did feel a bit like payback. But leverage for the money he owed me. After all the times he'd brushed me off, all the excuses, the humiliating bus ride, and being left alone at the convention center, I thought maybe this was the universe giving me a chance to reclaim some dignity. And my funds. I Googled if a laptop could be tracked without Wi-Fi. Turns out, if it's offline and the right features aren't enabled, it's fairly untraceable. So I carefully packed it, along with its charging cable, a fancy gaming mouse, headphones, everything Eric had. Then I locked it away in my storage unit, which was conveniently located in a spot with lousy reception and no available Wi-Fi. Even if he tried to track it, he'd come up empty. 6 hours passed. I was emotionally exhausted, trying to push the day's events out of my mind when my phone buzzed. Sure enough, Eric had decided he was ready to pick up his things. The way he phrased it, his things, was like a final slap in the face, as if my home was just a place he stored items, not where someone who cared about him lived. He said he was on his way and demanded I gather his stuff. I texted back that I'd leave his clothes and keychain outside the door, but I didn't want him inside my place. He panicked, complaining that somebody might steal his belongings if they were left unattended. Then he asked, "What about my laptop? Is it safe?" That was my cue. I wrote back, "What laptop?" Almost immediately, I saw 13 missed calls, all from him, one after the other. I let each one ring until it went to voicemail. My phone lit up with frantic messages, some threatening, some pleading, all about how I better not do anything to his expensive property. I ignored every single one, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in. I was fed up with always being the one who cared, while he gallivanted around with zero respect. Eventually, Eric showed up and started banging on my door like he owned the place. I still refused to let him in. In one last-ditch attempt to intimidate me, he called the police and told them I was withholding his belongings. When the cops arrived, I pretended to be calm and cooperative. I greeted them with polite cordiality, invited them to search my apartment. I told them I had no idea what laptop Eric was talking about, and I pointed to the clothes and keychain by the door. They had a look around, but of course they found nothing. The laptop was tucked safely in my storage unit, away from prying eyes and internet signals. The officers apologized to Eric, but explained that it was a civil matter. We can't force her to give you something she claims she doesn't have. They left, and Eric stood outside, furious and, to my shock, on the verge of tears. I'd heard Eric cry before, always during those breakup and makeup cycles, but never quite like this. He sounded genuinely desperate. For a moment, my heart twisted in guilt. I'm not a person who enjoys causing others distress. But then I remembered how he'd treated me just hours earlier, leaving me in tears outside a convention center like I was nothing. That memory helped me stay firm. Over the next few days, Eric tried contacting me repeatedly. He apologized in text messages, voicemails, and social media DMs, claiming he regretted the scene he made at Comic-Con. I responded with a simple, unwavering stance. We can talk about the laptop once I see $700 deposited in my account. Until then, we have nothing to discuss. Finally, he caved. I got a notification that he'd made a direct deposit of $700. When the funds cleared, I wrote back that I would return the laptop safely. I instructed him to meet me at a neutral location. He showed up looking nervous and defeated, probably expecting his laptop to be damaged or tampered with. Instead, I gave it back in perfect shape, exactly as he'd left it, accessories neatly packed. I wasn't out to ruin his property. I just needed him to take me seriously. He mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," then tried to apologize once more. I just shook my head, letting him know without words that it was over. No more back and forth, no more empty promises, and no more humiliating heartbreaks. If he needed money in the future, he could call Bella for all I cared. We haven't spoken since. Occasionally, I reflect on how our relationship reached that boiling point. It's as though all those red flags I'd ignored had finally caught up to me. Sometimes people promise the world, but if their actions never match up, those promises are meaningless. Ultimately, I got my $700 back. He got his laptop, and I got a hard-earned lesson in self-worth and personal boundaries. If there's anything to be learned from this entire fiasco, it's that we shouldn't ignore glaring signs of disrespect or untrustworthiness, whether in friendships or romantic relationships. Trying to rationalize red flags because you love someone often leads you down a slippery slope. Hopefully, the next time I see warning signals, I'll trust my gut and walk away before it comes to a showdown involving tears, the police, and a held hostage laptop. In the end, I'm grateful I stood up for myself, even though it involved some questionable tactics. For the first time in our on and off relationship, Eric felt the consequences of his behavior in a tangible way. And while I don't recommend anyone deliberately do something drastic, I won't deny it was satisfying to finally get the repayment he'd been avoiding and to prove that I wouldn't be walked over anymore.